There is a particular kind of silence that Windsor Castle keeps at night. Not the silence of emptiness, the silence of accumulation, 9 centuries of decisions made in closed rooms, of words spoken and then buried, of truths that were too large or too dangerous or too human to be allowed to survive the people who knew them. The stones here do not forget. They simply do not speak unless pressed. James Whitmore had been pressing himself against those stones for 19 years. He knew their temperature by season. He knew which corridor held cold air in August like a held breath, and which staircase in the east wing groaned under weight in a way that sounded, at 3 a.m., disturbingly like a name being called. He knew the chapel, St. George's private annex, not the great public one but the smaller one, the family one, tucked into the east wing like a secret the architecture had decided to keep. He knew its particular darkness. The way candlelight from the altar could leak under the door in a thin gold line and make a man on patrol think, for just a moment, that something was burning. It was 1:47 a.m. on the 14th of February. James saw the gold line under the chapel door and thought, something is burning. He was 41 years old, James Whitmore, salt and pepper close crop, the kind of posture that came not from vanity but from 2 decades of standing still in important rooms. His record was the kind other guards read during inductions, not because it was dramatic, but because it was consistent. 19 years without a formal reprimand, without a lapse in protocol, without a single incident report that required more than 2 pages. He was the human equivalent of a well-maintained clock. He kept time, he did not make news. February at Windsor meant skeleton staff. The family was in London. The public tour were suspended for the week. There were 6 guards on the overnight rotation, and James was the senior among them, which meant the east wing was his, the residential corridor, the private garden's entrance, and the family chapel. The posting was quiet. It was always quiet in February. He had done this exact route on this exact date 11 times before. He saw the light under the door. He did not radio it in immediately. This was not negligence. This was the same instinct that had kept his record clean for 19 years. The understanding that an alarm raised on incomplete information was not caution. It was panic wearing caution's uniform. He would look first. He would understand what he was looking at. Then he would decide what to do with what he saw. He moved down the corridor the way he always moved, weight on the outer edge of each step, breathing steady, hand near the radio but not on it. The chapel door was solid oak, original to the east wing's last renovation in 1962. It did not have a gap large enough to see through. But the chapel had acoustics. This was a thing James had learned in his first winter at Windsor. The private chapel was a sound trap. Something about the stone curve of the ceiling and the angle of the nave, and the way the thick walls funneled rather than absorbed. If you stood at the door, you heard the interior as though you were inside it. He had once, during a private family service, stood his post at the door and heard every word of a prayer spoken in a whisper at the altar 40 feet away. He stood at the door now. He heard a voice. Old, male. Careful, the way a man is careful when he is reading something he has memorized, but still does not trust himself not to stumble on. Reading aloud slowly, with the deliberateness of someone performing a ritual rather than conveying information. James listened for 11 seconds before he understood what he was hearing. Then he stood very still for another 40. The voice was reading a confession. Not a religious one. Not the I have sinned against the architecture of liturgy. A personal one, specific, named, dated. The voice read names James recognized, described events James had been alive during, laid out in the measured syntax of a man who had chosen his words with the knowledge that they might outlast him, a sequence of decisions made in the early years of a reign that had since become the bedrock of constitutional certainty. The decisions were not monstrous. That was the terrible thing. They were human, frightened, made by a man who loved his country and was not sure his country was going to survive the next decade intact, and who had done three things quietly, without parliament, without documentation, without the knowledge of the advisors who would have stopped him, to ensure that it did. Three things that were, by the strict architecture of constitutional law, not within his authority to do. Three things that the current reign's legal legitimacy rested on, in ways that even the current monarch almost certainly did not know. James stood at that door and felt the floor of his understanding shift. Not collapse, shift. The way stone shifts under centuries of weight, not breaking, but resettling into a new and slightly different shape. He had heard enough. He had heard too much. He pressed his hand flat against the oak door, steadied himself, and went in. Sir Geoffrey Marsh was 74 years old and kneeling on the stone floor in front of the altar, with the posture of a man who had decided that his knees were no longer a priority worth protecting. He was thin in the way of men who had been larger once, the frame still suggesting the former width, the clothes carrying it less convincingly. White hair kept, dark suit, the kind worn to funerals or to moments that deserved the same gravity as funerals. In his hands, open across his palms like an offering, was a leather journal, brown, aged, the kind of binding that suggested it had not been bought but assembled by someone who expected the contents to matter. He did not startle when James entered. He turned his head slowly and looked at James with an expression that James would spend the next 6 months trying to accurately describe to people who had not been there. The closest he ever got was a man who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has just been told he can set it down. "I wondered," Sir Geoffrey said, his voice the same measured instrument James had heard through the door, "how long before someone came?" James said nothing. His training had given him a script for intruders, for threats, for unauthorized personnel in restricted spaces. It had not given him a script for a 74-year-old retired archivist kneeling in a private chapel at 1:47 a.m., reading a dead king's confession to an empty room with the expression of a man fulfilling a promise. "Sir Geoffrey Marsh," James said finally. His voice came out steady. He was grateful for that. "Yes," said Sir Geoffrey, as if confirming something that required confirmation. "Still." James reached for his radio. The chapel ate the signal. This was a thing he knew, had always known, about the East Wing Annex. The stone walls were 3 feet thick, and the frequency had never been reliable inside. He had filed a maintenance note about it 4 years ago. The note had been acknowledged and then, in the way of institutional maintenance notes, quietly forgotten. He tried twice more, got static both times, a thick, unhelpful silence that managed to sound almost apologetic. Sir Geoffrey watched him try without comment, without satisfaction either. He simply waited. "The walls," James said. "Yes," said Sir Geoffrey. "I know. I've been coming here for 3 years. The signal has never worked." He paused. "I didn't plan it that way, but I won't pretend I wasn't grateful for it." James looked at the door. He could walk back out, move 10 feet down the corridor, reach his supervisor in 30 seconds. He could have this entire situation handed off to someone with the authority to handle it properly in under 2 minutes. He looked at Sir Geoffrey. He looked at the journal. He stayed. "How long have you had it?" James said. Not a question exactly. More like the first line of a conversation he was choosing to enter. "Since the night he died," Sir Geoffrey said. "He gave it to me himself 3 hours before." He looked down at the journal in his hands. He said, and these were his exact words, "I have never forgotten them," he said. "Geoffrey, this needs to not exist, but I find I cannot destroy it myself. So I'm giving it to you, and I'm asking you to make the decision I can't make." "And you didn't destroy it?" "No." "Why not?" Sir Geoffrey was quiet for a moment, not evasive, considering. The way a man considers a question he has asked himself 10,000 times and has never fully resolved. Because it was his, Sir Geoffrey said finally. Because he wrote it himself, every word in his own hand. Because a man who does difficult things in service of something he loves deserves to have some record that he knew what he was doing, that he wasn't careless, that he understood the weight of it. He closed the journal gently. If I destroyed it, it was as though the weight never existed, as though he carried nothing. That felt wrong. It felt like one more thing being taken from him, after he was no longer here to object. James had been a guard for 19 years. He had heard a great many justifications for a great many decisions. Some were self-serving, some were delusional, some were technically accurate but morally hollow. This one was none of those things. This one was grief, wearing the clothes of a constitutional crisis. "So you've been keeping it," James said. "In a fireproof box in my house in Berkshire, yes. And tonight you came here too. Read it aloud." Sir Geoffrey looked at the altar. "Once, to somewhere, to God if he's listening, to the walls if he isn't." A pause. "It's the anniversary of his death. I've come every year. Every year I've stood outside that door and told myself I was being sentimental and foolish and that I should go home." He looked at James directly. "This year I came inside." "Why this year?" "Because I'm 74 years old," Sir Geoffrey said. "Simply, completely. And I am beginning to understand that there are a finite number of years left in which I am capable of kneeling on a stone floor." James absorbed this. The chapel was very quiet around them. The gold candlelight on the altar moved in a draft that came from nowhere James could identify, and the shadows it cast on Sir Geoffrey's face made him look, briefly, like something carved rather than born, the face of a man on a monument, commemorating a loyalty that history had not yet decided how to name. "What's in it?" James said, specifically. Sir Geoffrey told him. It took 22 minutes. James stood. Sir Geoffrey remained kneeling. James offered once to find him a chair, and Sir Geoffrey declined with a small gesture that suggested the discomfort was deliberate, a form of penance he had no intention of abbreviating. The story Sir Geoffrey told was not simple. It did not resolve into a clean villain or a clean victim. It was the story of a king who had come to power during a period of constitutional fragility that the public had never fully understood, who had seen three specific scenarios: a succession challenge, a parliamentary deadlock, and a foreign entanglement that had the potential to trigger a constitutional referendum, and had taken three actions, quietly and alone, that foreclosed all three. The actions were not illegal in the way of theft or violence. They were illegal in the way of a doctor performing surgery without the paperwork. The outcome was arguably correct. The procedure was not authorized, and the patient had survived. The problem was that the patient, the monarchy, the institution, the constitutional order had not merely survived. It had thrived. And the thriving had become so thoroughly built into the structure of the current reign that unpicking it would require unpicking everything that had been built on top of it, including the current monarch's succession. Not directly, not cleanly, but in the way of legal dominoes. If this fell, it touched that, which touched the other thing, which touched something that was load-bearing. He knew, Sir Geoffrey said, he knew what he was doing to the people who came after him. That's why he wrote it down, not to confess to the church, to confess to himself, to acknowledge that he had made a choice that others would have to live with without knowing they were living with it. And if it became public, James said, Republican movements would use it, foreign governments would use it, constitutional lawyers would use it, some of them in good faith, some of them in very bad faith indeed. Sir Geoffrey paused. The current reign would survive, probably, but probably is a very expensive word when the institution you're spending it on has survived 900 years. James was quiet. He tried his radio again, out of something closer to habit than hope. "Static. What do you want to happen?" James asked. "Tonight, after tonight, what are you here for really?" Sir Geoffrey looked at him with the first expression of the conversation that James couldn't immediately read. "I want someone to know," Sir Geoffrey said. "Not to act on it, not to publish it or suppress it or hand it to lawyers or intelligence services. I want one living person, one person who serves this institution the way I served it, the way he served it, to know that he was not careless, that he saw the weight, that he carried it deliberately." He looked at the journal. "That's all I came here for. That's all I've ever wanted. Not justice, not exposure, just witness." The word landed in the chapel, the way words land in stone rooms. Witness. James looked at the journal in Sir Geoffrey's hands. "Give it to me," he said. Sir Geoffrey looked up. "Let me read it," James said. Not a summary, not your version, his. For the first time since James had entered the chapel, Sir Geoffrey's composure showed something underneath it. Not fear, something more fragile than fear. Hope, perhaps, the terrifying kind. He held the journal out. James took it. He read it standing. It took 31 minutes. The handwriting was precise. A man who had written official documents for 50 years had a particular relationship with legibility, a respect for the permanence of ink. The words were measured and without self-pity, which made them somehow more devastating than self-pity would have been. The king had written the journal over 3 days. He had numbered the pages himself. He had, on the final page, written a single line that was not part of the confession proper, a line that appeared to be addressed to whoever was reading, as though he had always known someone eventually would be. James read that line 3 times. He closed the journal. He stood in the candlelight of the private chapel at Windsor Castle at 2:34 a.m. on the 14th of February, and understood something that he would spend the rest of his career quietly carrying. Then he asked Sir Geoffrey the one question that mattered. Did he believe, James said, that he was right? Sir Geoffrey didn't hesitate. No, he said. He believed he was necessary. There is a difference. He was very clear about that distinction. He wrote about it on the second day. A pause. He said that rightness is a luxury available to people who are not responsible for outcomes, that the people who are responsible for outcomes have to make peace with necessity instead, and that making peace with necessity is not the same as being at peace. James nodded. He looked at the journal in his hands. He made his decision. He did not destroy it. He did not file a report. He did not call his supervisor or the duty officer or the palace's intelligence liaison or any of the 7 people that protocol, strictly followed, would have required him to contact before sunrise. What he did was this. He asked Sir Geoffrey to stand, helped him to his feet, one hand steadying the older man's arm on the way up, the way you help someone who has been kneeling too long and has forgotten, temporarily, that standing is possible. He walked with Sir Geoffrey to the chapel door. He said, "You've kept this for 3 years. You can keep it for the rest of your life if you need to. But I need you to tell me when you're gone, when there's no one left who was in that room with him, what happens to it then?" Sir Geoffrey was quiet for a long moment. "I have a letter," he said finally, "with my solicitor. Instructions for the journal to be delivered upon my death to the Royal Archives, sealed, embargoed for 75 years, accessible only by the reigning monarch of the time with written consent of the keeper of the records." James absorbed this. "So it doesn't disappear," he said. "No, and it doesn't detonate. Not for 75 years, by which time the dominoes have been rebuilt in different configurations," James said. "By which time what it reveals changes the historical record rather than the constitutional one." Sir Geoffrey looked at him with an expression James had not expected from a 74-year-old retired archivist at 2:40 in the morning. Respect, genuine, unguarded, and complete. "Yes," Sir Geoffrey said, "exactly that." James handed the journal back. "Then you've already solved it," James said. "You solved it 3 years ago. You just needed someone to confirm that the solution was sound." Sir Geoffrey held the journal against his chest with both hands. "I needed someone to witness it," he said. "Yes." James nodded once. "Go home, Sir Geoffrey," he said. "It's cold and you've been kneeling on stone for 2 hours and I need to finish my patrol." Sir Geoffrey smiled. It was a small smile and a real one, the kind of smile that arrives after a very long time of not being available. "Yes," he said, "I suppose I have." James walked him to the East Wing exit. Watched the car, a dark Jaguar, old enough to suggest a man who bought things to last, pull quietly down the Windsor Approach Road and disappear into the February dark. He went back to the chapel. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the altar. The candle Sir Geoffrey had lit, a single one, in the left stand, the family side, was still burning. It would burn for another 2 hours at least. James considered blowing it out and decided against it. He pulled the door shut behind him and finished his patrol. He tried his radio at the end of the corridor. It connected immediately. "Whitmore checking in," he said. "East Wing clear, chapel secure, nothing to report." The duty officer acknowledged and moved on. James stood in the corridor for a moment longer than necessary, looking at nothing in particular. Nothing to report. He turned and walked back toward the guard station, his footsteps steady and unhurried on the stone floors of a 900-year-old castle that had, in its long life, kept considerably larger secrets than this one. 6 months later, James Whitmore was appointed senior liaison to the Royal Archives, a newly created role, proposed by the keeper of the records and approved with unusual speed through palace administrative channels. The role required someone with both security clearance and, as the job description put it, demonstrated capacity for discretion in matters of institutional sensitivity. James had not applied for it. He accepted it without asking who had recommended him. Sir Geoffrey Marsh died the following March, peacefully, at his home in Berkshire, with his family around him. The obituaries noted his decades of service to the Crown, his reputation as the most meticulous archivist of his generation, his personal devotion to the institution he had served. One of them quoted a former colleague as saying that Geoffrey had been the kind of man who understood that preserving the record and protecting the truth were not always the same thing, and that knowing the difference was the rarest skill in his profession. James read the obituaries at his desk in the Royal Archives. The leather journal arrived at the archives 3 weeks after Sir Geoffrey's death, sealed and embargoed exactly as described. James processed the intake himself. He logged it in the system without reading the title Sir Geoffrey's solicitor had given it. He sealed it in the archival box with his own hands, wrote the embargoed date in the upper right corner, and placed it in its designated location in the restricted stacks. He did not open it. He already knew what was inside. More importantly, he knew what was outside it. The 75 years of ordinary life the institution would live without it, building its dominoes into new configurations, finding its footing on ground that did not know it was standing on borrowed time, doing the ordinary, extraordinary work of surviving. He had been asked, once, by a junior archivist who was new enough to ask questions the senior staff had stopped asking, what the most important thing was that he had learned in his career. James had thought about it for a moment. The difference, he said, between a truth that liberates and a truth that simply detonates. They can look identical from the outside. The whole job is learning to tell them apart. The junior archivist had written this down, which James found both touching and slightly alarming. He went back to work. Windsor Castle kept its particular silence that winter. The silence of accumulation. The silence of 9 centuries of decisions made in closed rooms and words spoken, and then carefully, deliberately, lovingly placed beyond reach until the world was ready to hold them without breaking. James Whitmore walked his patrol on the 14th of February, as he had done for 19 years, and would do for 9 more before he retired. The chapel was dark when he passed it. He paused at the door, listened. Nothing, the stones holding their temperature, the corridor keeping its counsel, the east wing breathing its slow institutional breath. He walked on. Some rooms, he had learned, do their most important work in silence. He had been a guard long enough to know the difference between an empty room and a room that was simply waiting. Tonight, the chapel was empty. He left it that way. Not blind obedience to protocol, not the comfortable certainty of rules that hold in clean conditions, but the harder thing, knowing when the rule is the institution, and when the institution is something the rule was never large enough to contain. That was what James Whitmore had learned on a February night, in a chapel where a dead king's voice had been read back to the walls by a man too loyal to let it disappear, and too wise to let it detonate. He carried it quietly. That, too, was a form of service.